This is Chase McWhorter, Managing Director with IREI. We're continuing our series on asset management, going across different property types, trying to dig into the subject. So today we're joined with Lauren Sullivan with Blue Owl, and we're going to talk about data centers. Lauren, if you could just introduce yourself and give us some background on yourself, Blue Owl, and then we'll jump into the questions. But thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. So, as you mentioned, Lauren Sullivan, I'm a managing director on the investment team at Blue Owl. I sit within our digital infrastructure group and I oversee investment management for our North America data center portfolio. And I've been focused on data centers for the last 8 years of my career. Prior to that, had spent some time in investment banking and private equity. And it's been a tremendous 8 years. If you have tracked what's been going on in the data center sector, it's been a wild ride. We've seen tremendous growth driven by, cloud compute, now the advent of AI. And so it's been a really exciting time to be in data centers and we've seen our portfolio, scale pretty meaningfully as a result.
Perfect. And maybe even just to provide further context again, if people haven't listened to the other ones we've done, part of the reason I wanted to do this was, and this goes back to probably 2024, is we saw tons of research coming out. Obviously, as rates went up, there was a lot of discussion about how groups are really going to have to focus on asset management, active asset management, really digging into the assets, the bottom up, all the different buzzwords.
Yep.
And part of our thought was just, again, kind of the pessimistic view is, okay, so as rates just kept going down, it wasn't a huge thing to manage. Um, so we wanted to go across all the different property types, data centers, as you mentioned, becoming quite popular the last few years. So that's kind of context on why we wanted to do this. It's from the investor perspective, just trying to give them going across these property types more intel in what it means from an asset management perspective. So, kind of starting with just the basics here, how do you define asset management when it comes to data centers?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think data centers as an asset class is interesting because it really sits at the intersection of traditional real estate asset management. You have infrastructure investing and underwriting. And then from our perspective, you also have wholly owned operating platforms. And so
Yep.
you really have to think about investment management and asset management across that life cycle. And from our perspective, we really think about assessing risk and maximizing returns across the entire life cycle of the investment. And you really have to bucket it. We're doing a lot on the ground up development side. And
Yeah.
so, asset management really starts on the front end as you're underwriting a new development. It's really critical that you have a feedback loop of what you see going on in your existing portfolio and really incorporating those assumptions on every new deal that you're doing.
Hmm.
And so asset management really starts at the front end and then through the life cycle of that investment. And so when you get into, actually owning and a ground up development, well, then you're going to move into tactical and execution and strategic oversight, really closely monitoring construction milestones, the CapEx budget, how you're getting to stabilization of that asset, pre-leasing versus forward investment.
Hmm.
We're really closely monitoring all elements of that ground up development. From a stabilized acquisition, you're really looking at assessing, okay, what is the infrastructure that's there? What is going to be your operating plan in terms of how are you going to drive margins and efficiency? Is there a releasing story? Is there a mark-to-market opportunity on the existing tenant? What is the credit quality? Sort of all of the ingredients that work towards how are you going to have a value maximizing exit for that investment. And so we really sit across that entire life cycle because so much of what we're doing is on the ground up development side, but we also acquire stabilized assets, through different core vehicles that we have as well.
Okay. So what does the day-to-day look like from an asset management perspective when it comes to data centers? And maybe even some context is, I mean, we heard a ton about obviously managing leasing teams and all the things that go on site from property management, which again, data centers being different than multifamily hospitality. So kind of from a day-to-day, what are some of the key things that your key milestones, KPIs you're trying to hit when it comes to asset management?
Look, it's a great question. I would take a step back and really talk about Blue Owl's approach to the sector is really to have a vertically integrated approach. And what I mean by that is at the investment team level and at the Blue Owl level, we've really invested in the domain expertise across the front end. So site selection, power procurement, build-to-suit, tenant lease negotiation. Then we get into construction risk management and what goes into that from a budgeting expertise, a schedule expertise. And then on the back end, when you have stabilized assets, managing to that efficiency and really driving to the exits and how we think about monetizing these assets. And so we've really been deliberate in having the skill sets at the Blue Owl level.
Okay.
But important to our strategy is having wholly owned data center developer and operators within our portfolio. So we have multiple captive data center development and operational companies that I also manage from a portfolio company perspective as well. And so for us, what it means day to day is a very close working relationship between the investment professionals that we have at Blue Owl and the operating teams within our portfolio companies. And it's really across every phase of that life cycle. We have teams that are day to day working through development feasibility, site diligence, power procurement, negotiating with tenants on the front end of leasing for large scale development projects. And then a
Hmm.
lot of my time is spent on the construction execution side of it. We have about 50 data centers that are in active construction right now in our North America portfolio. And so really breaking down at a granular level, how are we interacting with our development teams to get the right data out to track construction milestones, have a point of view on how are we tracking to the construction timeline, and then, relatedly, how are we tracking relative to budget? And we spend a lot of times on the front end working with our portfolio companies on the GMP contracting with the third-party GCs and subs that we work with and really managing that talent pipeline. And relatedly, making sure that our portfolio companies are investing in the talent of their teams to keep
Okay.
pace with the massive pipeline that we're executing upon. We never want resource availability to be the reason that we're not doing great deals. There
Yeah.
is so much activity in the market right now. There's so much demand. So I spend a lot of time making sure that we have the recruiting pipeline really up and running across our portfolio and at our team level to continue to execute at scale.
Hmm. Yeah, again, that jumps out as something that you don't hear when it comes to other. I mean, obviously there's talent management in a lot of different asset classes, but probably not to the scale of data centers. Um,
No, it's incredibly competitive, and you're actually seeing a lot of retraining of maybe folks that used to focus on other real estate asset classes that aren't seeing the same amount of growth, refocusing or retraining on some of the nuances of the data center side. We think a lot about we really think about it as the data center factory, right? At a basic
yeah.
level, that, there's the key ingredients of site selection, power procurement, development feasibility, leasing, and then getting to stabilized assets, and then spending a lot of time thinking about how do we recap, how do we monetize, large scale data center campuses, portfolios of assets, single asset sales. And as a sector, right, we've seen a lot of stabilized products come online over the last 5 years, a lot of which sits in closed end, drawdown funds that are going to need to see an exit and find a more permanent natural home for those stabilized data centers as well.
Okay. What would you say, because you mentioned this at the beginning, 8 years kind of focusing on data centers. So what would you say are some recent trends when it comes to asset management?
Yeah. Look, I would say scale and scarcity are two very prominent themes. And what I
Okay.
mean by that is 8 years ago, a 24 megawatt data center was a massive data center, right? And
Yeah.
now we're talking about gigawatt sized campuses. And so because of the scale of the workloads, the scale of, compute demand that we're seeing from the hyperscale customers, think Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, Meta, they want to really think about securing capacity where they can grow contiguously. It is much more efficient for the customer to grow in a campus environment and adjacent to existing campuses. It allows them to leverage the fiber network infrastructure that is already there. It
Okay.
also allows them to leverage their employee base, right? Our tenants employ their own technicians and employees that sit inside our data centers. And so if they can leverage that investment in the workforce, that is much more efficient from the tenant's perspective as well. And so much of what we've seen over the last 8 years and having to evolve as an asset manager is to be able to develop and operate at that scale. And from our perspective, I touched on it, it certainly means the domain expertise to navigate large scale data center development and operations, but it's also on the capital side, right? Depth of capital markets reach is critical to be a player at scale right now in the data center sector. So
So,
that's the scale side. And then just touch on the scarcity side.
yeah,
Because we've seen such tremendous demand, over the last 8 years, what we really see globally, but certainly, domestically in North America, is the availability of large scale land and power
yeah.
to support the scale of these projects is materially constrained. And so that is really what has helped, you touched on rising interest rate environment and how that has, pressured real estate asset management sort of generally. What the data center sector has benefited from is that scarcity has really driven a lot of landlord, pricing power.
What would you say, and I think the scale and scarcity would touch on this, but maybe if there are other things that make asset management of data centers different from other asset classes.
Yeah, look, I think it's a critical infrastructure, right? It is a technical build. And so it
Mhm.
is not as straightforward as just going and putting up an industrial warehouse box. As
Yeah.
you think about design and you think about what can go into the scope of landlord's build, it can include all of the redundant mechanical and electrical equipment that really just provides redundancy to make sure that the data center always has access to electricity, so it has uptime,
Mhm.
and then it has, redundancy in its cooling technology to make sure that, temperature is maintained in the data center, to make sure that the servers and the hardware that's running in there, are operating at high efficiency and maximizing useful life. And so there has obviously been an evolution in design over time, and that's really where depth of your hyperscale relationships and repeat business is really critical to how we think about executing on that technical side. And what I mean by that is, if you think about embarking on a large scale 500 megawatt ground up development campus, you really want to make sure that you're master designing that campus in a way that your target hyperscale tenant base want to buy. And so that really means collaborating with the design teams at those customers to understand, okay, what are their priorities? How do they think about different cooling designs? Is it water-based cooling? Is it air-based cooling? Do they want two-story, three-story? And so there's really been this evolution, and that's where the close working relationships that we've invested in over the last 8 years, really bear a lot of fruit, because you want to make sure that you're designing to where your customers want to go, and that your designs are flexible. We get that question a lot, right? We have this advent of AI workloads. How do you know that, the data center you're designing today is going to be, relevant or needed in 15 years? Well, there's a lot of alignment with the hyperscale customers, right? These are long-lived assets. They're signing 15 to 20-year leases. They want to make sure that, there's flexibility in design to really handle different workloads over time as their business needs may evolve. And so I would say that that's a critical part of making sure you have that technical expertise that can pair with the customers as you think about bringing new capacity online.
Hmm. So when it comes, obviously you talked about cooling technology, things like that. And this, again, these questions for other property types would be different as far as what role does technology play in asset management of data centers? Again, think multifamily hospitality, a lot of times it's more prop tech type things.
Hmm.
Data centers can be a little bit obviously more involved from the technology, the chips, all that. But from an asset management perspective, what role does technology play? Is it largely at the design level? Do you have different tools that you're using? Just curious
Yeah.
broadly on technology.
Look, it's a good question. I do want to make a clarification, at least within our strategy. The
Mhm.
demarc point of the scope of CapEx that's within sort of landlord versus tenant responsibility, we do not have exposure or responsibility for the servers or the chips.
Okay.
That is the tenant's responsibility. And that is where we see a lot of the technological evolution and things, becoming outdated. And that refresh scope is all on the customer side. We are
Yeah.
responsible for the shell of the building, the utility hookup. Sometimes that's all we're responsible for. That would be a powered shell data center lease,
Yep.
where it's very light, sort of a vanilla approach to data centers. A turnkey data center is where we're also responsible for the mechanical and electrical plant, which is generators, battery systems, whatever if it's air cooled or water chilled, technology and equipment, to maintain that data center. So I just want to call that out because that is an
Yeah.
important distinction when we think about, obsolescence risk on the technology side. We really equate it to like the TV and the plug. We are the cord and the plug and the outlet have not changed, over the last, however many years the TVs have been around. But what has changed materially is what's inside the TV, right? And we
Okay.
equate that to the tenant scope. Chips and servers have changed a lot. Generators haven't changed in about 60 years. And so
Okay.
a lot of stability from the technological obsolescence point of view. But from the asset management side, when we think about use of technology, we're really thinking about it of how can we, really leverage the talent and the workforce we have to be more efficient. If you think about the scale that we're developing, the size of these projects, and then just across our portfolio, we think a lot about what software tools can we use to better track all of those, KPIs that are really critical for us maintaining our portfolio around construction milestones, budget
Mhm.
health, change order tracking, right? All of those elements of data center construction. And so we've invested a lot in software tools that can just help have really great, data, accurate data, and real-time data coming out of our projects to allow us to really see across the portfolio, get ahead of spotting, challenges or things that we need to monitor on a project. So that's on the construction side. Certainly within a live operating data center, there's a lot of technology that's used within the data center to just have a sense of the operating environment, right? There's a lot of sensors on the equipment that are measuring temperature, they're measuring power flow and spikes, right? A lot of data that we need as the operators of the data center and that we share with the end user in the data center as well so that they have real-time visibility into their workloads and into their data center environment as well.
Okay. And that's actually a really good point because I think that there's an assumption that data centers are a lot more technological as far as that risk of obsolescence. When you get to it, the generator thing sticks out that that hasn't changed in 60 years.
Exactly.
No, I think that's a really good point. And that kind of leads to the next question, because again, a lot of these questions that we ask, it's coming from more of an investor perspective as they're evaluating all of these different property types. So, what insights do you have for investors about asset management in data centers? What should they be asking when it comes to asset management during their due diligence?
Look, I think it's a good question. I would say, from my perspective, one of the key elements comes down to track record and experience set of the team. Because as we just walked through, right, this is a more technical and nuanced asset class. And
Yeah.
so is you think about an ability to appropriately diligence and manage a data center investment, whether that's on the stabilized side, or on ground up development. I think it really comes down to what is the track record of the team that has a long-standing experience with that asset class, who knows what to look for in data center diligence across,
Mhm.
stabilized and development, and what does that team and strategy look like. And so I think being able to invest in a strategy that has the ability to capture development economics, but can also, marry that with stabilized acquisitions, the right cost of capital for stabilized, and the right skill set to appropriately diligence and understand, what is the strategy for any type of asset is critical. Because I think, as we talked about, there's a lot of people that are attuned to the opportunity in data centers, maybe are repositioning away from other real estate asset classes, but that bringing that know-how and that technical expertise, I think, is critical to be able to continue to execute at scale. And certainly, if you are on the development side, the level of customer engagement and strength of relationships is really important, right? It is a
Yeah.
concentrated customer universe. Now, again, concentrated to the largest technology companies, highest credit quality companies in the world. But what it means is that working relationship is really important. Is their trust, is their track record with these hyperscale tenants that allows you to, have conviction that these operators and asset managers are going to continue, to scale their business.
Hmm. Well, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one thing we hear a lot when it comes to data centers, and that's where I think the asset management kind of ties into this, is there's a lot of groups seeing the returns you can get in data centers. So I think the concern is a lot of tourists, a lot of data
Yeah.
center tourists, just seeing land, we'll figure out power. So I do think that that's something that you speak about track record and those kind of things. I think it does get a little bit more involved than just we're going to go find some land and
Absolutely.
hopefully get some power.
And I would say that it's a really great point because where we've seen the crackdown the most on the tourists is actually from the utilities
Yeah,
because of the power scarcity that utilities are seeing, nationwide. We've seen, anyone can apply to the grid for connection.
yeah,
We've seen that queue for power connection requests in some markets, tenfold increase.
yeah,
And it's a lot of people that don't have a real tenant behind them, don't have the expertise to actually develop the data center, but maybe see land and see it as an opportunity. And so the utilities have really evolved their approach to say, hey, if you're going to be in the queue requesting a large connection, you have to come with real collateral requirements, whether that's posting a surety bond or a letter of credit. You're going to have milestones where you actually have to start to execute on the development. You might have days when you have to, a date by which you have to start actually drawing down on the power, minimum utilization. And so
yeah,
those, new elements being introduced by the utilities has really helped weed out those that are serious developers, those that are coming with the scale, with the balance sheet, and with the relationships to execute on these projects versus just, trying to tie up power and see what can happen.
yeah. So what would you say are your expectations and outlook, again, looking at the last 8 years, kind of what you've seen recently, what are your expectations when it comes to asset management of data centers for the year ahead, and maybe even beyond a year? Kind of what do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, I would say a bit of a tale of two cities in that
Yeah,
on the development side, and so it's really around those that have the skill set to go navigate, large scale site selection. Site assemblage is a big part of site selection because
yeah,
no longer are there just, massive sites that are in a nice rectangle shape, right? This is approaching 30 different landlords or 30 different landowners in a market to try to assemble a campus and get through entitlements or rezoning and all of those things. And so there's going to, for groups that have that skill set, and so a big push on our side to continue to find those projects, and bring them to fruition and the talent to bring them to bear. But we have, as an industry, this growing base of stabilized data centers that, as I mentioned, need to find, exits, need to find a more permanent home.
well, that's the end of the series of questions we had. I do want to thank you again for taking the time. I know obviously you're touching on all the things you're working on, so appreciate you taking the time to go
Absolutely.
through this. Um, yeah, we're again going to be publishing these videos, interviews over the next, I think, couple months. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest when it comes to data centers, just given how much money is flowing into there.
Yep.
So I want to thank you for taking the time again.
No, absolutely appreciate it. Take care.
All right.